Welcome to Our World Today. We have as our guest today John Peterson, and our topic is socialism. John, welcome to the program.
Thanks a lot.
John is editor of the Socialist Appeal, which is a national publication, and he is also the national secretary of the Workers' International League, which is the body which is responsible for publishing the Socialist Appeal. And one of the hats you wear, which I find quite admirable, is that as one of your duties, it appears, as the National Secretary of the Workers' International League, is to travel around the world. You had traveled to Spain, and now you've recently been down to Mexico lecturing on socialism, and I just think that that's just such a wonderful lifestyle. Had you, at one point, had you envisioned your life turning out the way it has now?
Well, I've always liked to travel. I grew up in Mexico in part and lived in different parts of the country. But what's most important is, as you said, what I get to do when I get to travel, which is to talk about socialism, to explain the ideas of socialism to people, to explain the situation in the United States, to explain the economic situation, the social situation, the political situation, because there's a lot of misconceptions around the world as to what's really going on in the United States. There's a lot of illusions in the so-called American dream, and a lot of people who think that in the United States it's just not possible to have socialists. So one of the things that I get to do is explain to people, look, the economic situation here is actually nowhere near as nice as it looks on television or in Hollywood, and that there are people in this country that are fighting against injustice, that are fighting against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that are fighting against the exploitation of workers in this country and around the world, against racism, against discrimination, and ultimately fighting for socialism. And so I'm really privileged that my work allows me to do that in a lot of different places.
And at what point did you become a political activist and get involved in all of this?
Well, when I was younger, in high school even, I first got involved a little bit in some political activism, for example, in environmental rights and anti-racism, and the pro-choice movement and things like that. And for a while, I got involved in these different things, but I felt after a time that I really wasn't making an impact. Nothing was really changing. These were all kind of, everything I did would maybe put a little Band-Aid on a much bigger problem. And I actually became a little bit disillusioned with political activism for a number of years. And it was after college, actually, when I moved to London, England, with a degree in history and anthropology. So I was still obviously interested in humanity and history and the interconnections between why one thing happened before another, or why this led to this event happening. All those interconnections always interested me, but I had no real theory of why history happened, of why social change happens, of what politics was even, despite having a degree in history and anthropology. So when I was living in London, I happened to meet some folks who introduced me to the ideas of Marxism. I read the Communist Manifesto, which is sort of the founding document of the Marxist, the socialist, the communist movement. And that document, the Communist Manifesto, which I really recommend everybody form their own opinion of it. Don't read just what people say about it. Form your own opinion of it. Because a lot of people have an opinion on Marxism, but it's usually not their own opinion. So I decided, well, I don't really understand this. I think I'm going to look into it. I read that document, the Communist Manifesto, and it really changed my whole perspective. It really allowed me to understand that the problems in society are at root caused by the existence of classes in society, the exploitation of one class by another. In our current society, where you have the working class majority, which is being exploited by a capitalist minority, and to understand that that struggle between the different classes throughout history is what's really propelled history forward, and which then allows for a real fundamental change to be possible, which is what the conclusion of the manifesto, the Communist Manifesto, is, that based on this class struggle, based on the material conditions that have developed within capitalism itself, which did play a relatively progressive role, historically speaking, in the past, although it's always been a very exploitative system. It's always been a system of extracting value from workers. It nonetheless historically played a relatively progressive role. But what it has done in the grand scheme of history is established the material foundations for us to now build socialism. In other words, socialism, Marxism, it's not just a good idea to think that we could have socialism, that society could possibly be organized differently. It's an actual material potential. There actually is enough to go around for everybody. There is enough food to go around. There is enough housing to go around. There is enough work that needs to be done for everybody to have a job. These things are actually possible. But the way that we humans ourselves have structured our current society means that some people go without, while a tiny handful of people have a great amount of wealth concentrated in their hands. And all that socialists want, that myself as a Marxist want, is to have the wealth and the resources of society, the technology, the people's ability to work and so on, to be democratically planned by the workers themselves. After all, we're the vast majority of society, and if we are to live in a truly democratic society, then those decisions as to what we do with our wealth, and I'm talking about society as a whole, I'm not talking about your individual car or your individual television set, that's your personal property, that's your business, what you want to do with those things. But I'm talking about the real key levers of the economy, the big banks, the big factories, and of course the land, which we all rely on in order to eat, that those things should be democratically planned so that we can use them in the interest of the whole of society instead of the interest of a tiny minority who, get all the benefits.
Well, I would like to underline the word democratic, or you were saying democratically, and my memories of reading looking at the Communist Manifesto were that I was impressed that Marx and Engels, was it? Marx and Engels advocated that the ideal socialist or communist or Marxist system would be, in its nature, a democratic system, and I think that's really important to emphasize. But now that I'm saying that, do I also recall that it also involved revolution to begin with, or is that, or perhaps we can have a peaceful transition to this sort of an ideal democratic system?
Sure. I mean, I think it would be, there's a lot of misconceptions about the democratic nature of socialism or not. A lot of people confuse what we had in the Soviet Union, which was, in my opinion, it was clearly not democratic socialism. It was a totalitarian dictatorship that was not at all democratic, where the workers, although the economy was under state control, which is the economic sort of basis, the economic foundation for socialism, that economy was not run democratically by the workers themselves in the interests of everybody. So what you ended up having was a system where a caste of society were using this state property to benefit themselves. What we're in favor of is for all those key levers of the economy, as I explained before, to be under the control of the state, to be public property, but for that state to be under democratic public control. Leon Trotsky, who was another great Marxist, he was one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, he explained that socialism is like oxygen for the body. Socialism requires democracy like the body requires oxygen. How can you possibly run such a large, complex economy without the direct democratic participation of the working class, and that's what we advocate. So I think a lot of people confuse when they hear the word socialism or communism. They automatically think about, you know, Stalin or Mao or one of these things. And if they actually go and read Marx and Engels and Lenin and Trotsky, they will see that it's through and through. It's a very democratic spirit that they advocate, because you know, after all, if we are in a democratic society, the majority, which is the working class in this society, the vast majority of us all, you know, work for a living. We get a paycheck for a living. We have to sell our ability to work to someone in order to get a paycheck, in order to survive. We are workers. Some people might make a little bit more. Some people might make a lot less, actually. There's a lot of very poor workers in this country, people who work, you know, 40, 50, 60 hours, 2 or 3 jobs a week, and they still can barely make ends meet. But, you know, if you sell your labor power for a wage, you're technically classified as a worker. That vast majority of society should have democratic control. I think that's actually a very it's an idea that connects very organically with sort of Americans' ideas about how society should be. I mean, Americans, I think, have traditions of great democratic traditions. I mean, we celebrate the 4th of July every year. Of course, nowadays, a lot of people see it as a sort of you know, summer barbecue, and that's all well and good. But if we go back to the origins of that holiday, it was obviously based on a revolution. It was based on a group of people living in the United States who no longer wanted to live under the subjugation of the English king, and they had a revolution. Now, you mentioned the possibility of a revolution or the necessity of a revolution. I believe that we need a revolution in this country. And what is a revolution, though? Well, a revolution is a couple things. First of all, of course, it's a profound transformation in the economic structure of society. And it's also when the majority of the population, when the working class, comes out of its sort of generalized, you could say almost indifference or even apathy towards politics, enters the stage of history then and sort of begins to seize its own destiny in its hands. We've seen revolutionary processes. Now, that's another important thing to emphasize, that a revolution isn't a single act, it isn't a single day. A revolution is a process of that transformation of the consciousness of the working class, where it by degrees becomes aware of its potential to actually play a role in society. And there's big leaps in consciousness. Sometimes people who didn't think they had any role to play in politics or in society or in the economy all of a sudden come out on the streets, for example, in Venezuela, which is a subject that I'm very interested in, because there's a revolution taking place in Venezuela right now where you have this exact process taking place, where the vast majority of society has, as compared to 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, has all of a sudden entered the stage of history, so to speak, has decided that we want to say in how our lives are run, and they're getting involved in politics. And what's going on then in Venezuela is this process whereby there's a sort of struggle between those who want to move towards genuine socialism, which would require that the economy, again, the banks, the land, and the big industries be nationalized and put under public control, to be run democratically by the workers themselves, in what we could call workers' control over the factories and so on. And those people who think that we shouldn't do that we shouldn't make those fundamental transformations. So I think that in the United States we do need a revolution, both in the sense of average Americans coming out and playing a real role in politics and in economics and in their lives, and also that fundamental transformation in how our economy is set up.
So it seems like there's a threshold point where you have to let go of capitalism and just jump off the cliff, so to speak, and just jump into socialism. And is there a point where the two are just simply incompatible with each other?
Well, I really like the way you put that there's this threshold sort of turning point where you have this sort of qualitative change in the situation. In science, it's often referred to as a tipping point, or the edge of chaos, if you've looked into chaos theory, which is actually a very, well, it's a whole interesting subject on its own. The fact that chaos theory basically confirms Marxist philosophy, which is called dialectical materialism. That's a whole other discussion, I guess. But that sort of that tipping point, that turning point, is a very important concept for Marxists. For example, a volcano. Volcanoes don't erupt out of the blue. Obviously, it might seem like it, but we understand now with modern science and seismology and so on that there's an accumulation over years, decades, maybe even centuries possibly, of pressure, of all the lava and the gases and the heat and all that stuff building up underneath the surface of the Earth, which all of a sudden explodes out in the form of a volcano or an earthquake. It doesn't really come out of the blue. And the same thing applies to society, where you have beneath the surface, beneath the apparently calm surface of society, you have an accumulation of frustration, of anger, of just discontentment with the way things are going, which can then all of a sudden explode to the surface. And that's kind of that tipping point, that turning point where, for example, in December, there was a factory in Chicago called Republic, the Republic factory. They make windows and doors. It was about to be shut down. Out of the blue, the bosses, the owners, decided they were going to shut down the factory, fire the workers. They weren't going to pay them their severance pay. They were also owed back wages and all sorts of things like that. And all of a sudden, those workers who maybe just a couple, 3 years earlier, or even days earlier, had never imagined that they would do something like this, they all of a sudden occupied the factory. They decided, okay, enough is enough. We're not going to take it anymore. We're going to occupy this factory to demand, A, we want our wages, and if we're going to lose our jobs, we at the very least want our severance pay. But they were actually fighting to keep the factory open, to keep their jobs. Obviously, if they lose their jobs, they could lose their homes, they could lose their cars, they could have all kinds of problems, obviously. So it's a very important issue. But that turning point was reached where they decided we have to do something about it. And what's really interesting, real quick, is that it turns out that those workers at that factory in Chicago, they got the inspiration for occupying their factory from the Occupied Factories movement in Venezuela, and actually from some people that I know personally that are involved in the Occupied Factories movement in Venezuela with this group called Freteco, which is the Revolutionary Front of Occupied Factories. They had actually visited Venezuela. These Chicago workers, some of them had visited Venezuela, had met with these workers, and got the idea that, hey, we actually run this place. We actually we turn the machines on, we make them run, we produce all the goods. We know best how this place works. What does this owner, really know about this place? We should actually be running this place. And they got that inspiration directly from Venezuela, which shows how, especially with this economic crisis where you have a globalized economy, and now we're seeing a globalized economic crisis, you can also have we are seeing the beginnings of globalized revolution, and how events in one country and the actions of workers in one country can have a direct effect on the actions of workers in other countries. So,
well, I just had a light bulb idea when you're talking about this factory, and you tell me if this is a valid comparison. So I'm thinking, well, there is the possibility, if the owners of the factory would allow it, that this factory actually become a worker-owned factory, and perhaps the factory could stay in business that way, with taking with stopping the taking of the cream off the top, the profit. Now, all of a sudden, I'm comparing that. I am comparing that to the arguments for single-payer health care, where you take away the profits of the healthcare companies and simply have a system without that 15% administrative expense, or in the case of the factory, the profit. And then the system which is now failing, will work. Am I on to something now? Is that a very I suppose that's a pretty simple concept for you, and hopefully you'll stroke my ego and say, well, of course, Bill, that's how it would work.
Well, the problem that I see with basically what you're describing would be a worker-owned cooperative, where the workers would all become essentially shareholders of their own company, is that it would still be operating within the limits of a capitalist market, of a capitalist economy. What we think needs to happen, what I think needs to happen, what we in Socialist Appeal think needs to happen, is that those key industries need to be under public control to be run by the workers. Now the difference, of course, is that the workers would then be working in the public interest if they're working for a public company. Just like, you know, the post office today, it's a national service, it's very useful, millions of people benefit from it. Those workers are working for the public, essentially. Now, of course, the post office is, again, working in a generalized capitalist market atmosphere, so it's not a perfect example, but it's an example of something where you have a social need, and where there's public ownership of this company that can then be run in the interests, generally speaking, within the limits of this broader capitalist market of the whole of society. The problem with the worker ownership thing this is not just a theoretical thing. This has been tried multiple times throughout history, even in Venezuela, for example, where once the workers become basically mini shareholders of their own little capitalist company, you're still dealing with competition. You're dealing with who's been there longer. What happens if they want to expand production and they want to hire more workers? Are those workers then going to become owners, or are they going to be hired on by the company and then exploited just as if they'd worked for any other company? So you get those contradictions. That's why we think that, for example, in Venezuela and also ultimately in the United States, that you need 100% public ownership and 100% democratic workers' control. As far as single health care is concerned, 100% agree with you on that what we need is a socialized healthcare system where we all pool our resources to get quality healthcare for all. I mean, as you said, there's tremendous costs that are on top of the actual caregiving aspects of the healthcare system that go towards the pharmaceutical companies, they go towards the insurance companies, they go towards the big the big private hospitals and so on that get massive profits off the health or the illness rather of the rest of society. And if you get rid of all those sort of middlemen that are basically, like you said, screaming the crop off, we could have better access to health care and have access for everybody. The United States spends more on health care than I think any other industrialized country on the planet, and yet we have 47 million people that don't have access to health care. 18,000 Americans die every year because they don't have access to basic health care, or because they don't go to the hospital in time, because of course they're going to get charged. And even if we do have health care, there's these tremendous co-pays and big insurance premiums that you have to pay every month, whether you use it or not. If we pooled all those resources collectively, we could have quality health care for everybody. And so that's definitely a very socialist conception. And I think a lot of people that agree with universal health care are, without knowing it, actually agreeing with a basically socialist idea. And it shows that it's not an alien concept that we should have these kind of socialized institutions. I think a lot of people are actually in favor of these things.
So am I correct in thinking that one of the reasons the socialist ideology is so appealing is that because it eliminates the whole problem of exploitation? Well, it takes out capitalism and thereby removes exploitation as well.
Sure. I mean, we're not going to get rid of exploitation and capitalism and money and all that kind of stuff overnight. It's going to be a process. Society's going to have to work its way through some of these remnants of the old society. But it can happen relatively quickly, where if people are working sort of for the common good, as it were. I mean, people will still get paychecks, people will still have money. People will still, in this, once we get rid of the capitalist profit motive, people will still be able to go on vacations. People will, in fact, be able to have a lot more free time because we'll be dividing up all the labor of society amongst everybody. I mean, why is it that today there's some people who are unemployed and other people that work 60 hours a week? Why don't we sort of, divide that up and everybody could maybe work 20 hours a week? And once you get rid of the big profit motives and all the advertising and all the waste that we see under capitalism, people could actually be paid more. And then gradually, as we pool our resources, we could have, like I said, universal health care for everybody. Education should certainly be universal and free for everybody. And all these other kinds of basic services that we can have. We could have much cheaper housing because we don't have to spend, thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars sometimes in mortgage payments, interest payments to the banks or to the landlords who basically own a piece of paper that says you owe me, $1,000 a month or whatever your rent is. I mean, the expenses that people will have will fall down, and your wages will go up. Your protections at work will go up. It'll be under union conditions. Much more safe working conditions for everybody. More time off. I mean, who wouldn't want that? So I mean, I think that is part of the appeal. That you're eliminating this exploitation where you are forced to sell your ability to work to a boss. If you don't, what are your options? A lot of people, and I'd say the vast majority of people around the planet, live in very poor conditions. If they miss one paycheck, they could miss the rent payment. They could then end up on the streets. They could get their car taken away from them by the bank or whatever. I mean, people literally are living one paycheck away from absolute disaster, and so they're forced then to go to work, to do jobs that are perhaps not very healthy or that don't pay very well because they don't have any other option. So therefore they are being exploited. And of course, one of the most appealing things about socialism is that we would eliminate this exploitation where one individual is exploiting literally millions of other people. I mean, biologically speaking, nobody is born rich or poor. A baby isn't rich, a baby isn't poor. How is it that this one baby then grows up to be a billionaire and this other baby has to work in a coal mine and die at age 25 of, I don't know, miner's lung or whatever? I mean, there's nothing biological about humanity that means that one group should be exploiting another. These structures were put in place by humans ourselves, and we therefore have the power to change them.
So you're doing a wonderful job of explaining how socialism is good for the little guy. It's good for economic justice or social justice, if you prefer. Now, what about our viewers who are thinking, yeah, but what about me? What do I have to give up so the little guy can have a piece of the pie? What do I lose? Do I lose my second car? Do I lose my trip to Hawaii? What is your answer to that person who perceives themselves to be middle class or upper middle class? What are we entering a classless society where I have to now eat grains and everybody is allowed one sprig of broccoli per day, or what do I lose in this system?
Well, unless you're a multi-billionaire, you're actually going to gain a lot of things. I mean, people that consider themselves upper middle class or middle class or whatever, really speaking, most people in that sort of bracket are workers. I mean, they're a bit better paid. They might be professionals, or they might be, work for the government, some of them, or they might work for I don't know, they might be even, higher paid nurses or whatever, or higher paid auto workers or whatever, that consider themselves middle class, but ultimately they're workers. They're selling their labor power for a wage. Therefore, they're workers. Now, I think it's important to keep in mind that I, John Peterson, am not going to decide these things, what we're going to do to you or to the auto worker or to the nurse or to whomever. Society as a whole, again, is going to democratically decide how we want to use the resources of society. But the great thing about the situation we're in today is that, especially in a country like the United States, which is, after all, the wealthiest country on earth, there is enough to go around for everybody. I mean, there should be no need to ration one sprig of broccoli or whatever to people. In fact, farmers are paid not to grow their crops. Farmers are paid to burn their crops. Clothing stores burn their clothing, or they punch holes in it in order to, before they throw it in the dumpster, so nobody can use it. Why? Because that would flood the market and lower the prices of their brands and things like that. That's an insane way of running society, frankly. I mean, any rational person, I think, would agree that if there's food here and there's a hungry person there, that we could bring those two things together. Yet capitalism can't even provide that. Any rational person would think that a young person wanting an education, wanting to study science, wanting to study any number of subjects, art, philosophy, to enrich themselves and to enrich society, and perfectly good university campuses and so on that could certainly accommodate more students. You could hire more teachers and so on. Instead, you have the students that can't get into college because they can't afford it. You'd think you could put those things together. You've got homeless people over here, empty houses here. Why can't we put those things together? You've got perfectly skilled workers over here who want to work, who want to get a job, and you've got factories that the latest figures are that U.S. factories are running only at about 70% capacity. That means there's 30% more capacity in this country today, as we film this show, that could be used. That there's space for those unemployed workers to be working in those factories, and yet because profit margins are starting to fall, because consumption is starting to fall, and all this kind of stuff, those people are forced to be unemployed, and these factories, or big chunks of those factories, are left idle and not put to use, so that the owners can make bigger profits. That's, I think, an irrational way of organizing society. And therefore, I think what I would say to the vast majority of your viewers, I imagine that there's not many multi-billionaires or multi-millionaires watching our show. The vast majority, 99.999%, are going to benefit from this more rational and democratic organization of society's wealth and resources. They're not going to have anything taken away. They're not going to have their second TV set taken out of their house and sent off to some poor family in India or something like that. The idea is that everybody's quality of life, the vast majority of everybody's quality of life, is going to start improving. Not only in material terms, but as I said before, in fewer work hours, more free time, more lifelong education, better health because you have access to health care. Quality of life as a whole will improve for everybody. And in poor countries and in poor parts of the United States, in poor parts of our own city, we will be raising everybody's quality of life. It's not about pushing down people's quality of life and making everybody equal and making everybody equally poor. It's not about sharing the poverty. It's about sharing the wealth of society, because society is actually very wealthy. And I think that's what people need to understand. Nobody's going to be taking away things from them. Their little fishing boat, their little weekend cabin to go hunting in the fall or to go fishing in the summer or whatever, that's not going to be taken away from them. We're talking about the big banks, the big factories, and the big, huge agribusiness landowners, you know. And I think a lot of people instinctively understand this. If I could just relate a quick anecdote to you. I was flying back through O'Hare in Chicago a few weeks ago, and it happened to be on the Monday when it was announced that 68,000 jobs were lost. 68,000 jobs in a single day. Pretty incredible. And this came up on CNN at the airport, in the airport waiting area, as you're waiting for your flight. And there were 3 airline workers who I was sort of next to, because I was checking my flight times. They were watching the screen, and they saw this 68,000 workers, and they were like, geez, that you could tell they looked worried about this going on, that this was happening. And then one of them said, well, it's really too bad because all they had to do was fire 5 people. And the other 2 guys looked at him and said, what do you mean? And he said, well, the CEOs of United Airlines, Continental Airlines, American Airlines, the CEOs, not all the workers. And then the other guy, they had a good laugh, of course. And then one of them said, well, no, actually, it should be 10 people. And they said, well, why 10 people? Well, you forgot the CEOs of the banks, Citibank, Bank of America, etc. They instinctively understand that it's really a handful of people at the top, of super wealthy people, that are causing all of this misery. And then the other guy said, yeah, they can get on their private jet, they can get on their Learjet and fly off, I don't care where, never to return. I mean, these are just, these aren't Marxists talking, these weren't socialists, these are just average, ordinary airline workers. I think a couple of them were mechanics waiting to go on the plane, and the other guy was just working the check-in desk or whatever. These aren't, people that have read, most likely, maybe they have read some Marx, I don't know, but these aren't people that would, run around, talking about Marxism and socialism and revolution. These are just ordinary workers reacting to the realities of the situation, to the realities of capitalism, which as a system is itself creating the conditions, as I said before, the material conditions for socialism, and also affecting people's consciousness in such a way that they're beginning to question the very foundations of the system, or at the very least at this stage to come to the understanding that it's just a handful of people that are sort of running the show and wrecking it for the rest of us.
Well, I'm having a bit of a moral crisis right now because I'm not agreeing with your statement that there's enough to go around. Well, I can't say that. I neither disagree or agree. I'm just not convinced that there's enough to go around, and perhaps I'm expressing a fear in the culture which actually supports the system. I wish I shared your conviction that yes, we can, and there is enough for everyone.
Let me rephrase it. There is enough of the basics right now for nobody to starve, for everybody to have a basic education, for everybody to have a decent job, and for everybody to have a home a roof over their heads, to live in a home. There are enough of those basics. I'm not saying that there's necessarily enough of, flat screen TVs or whatever it is for every single human on the planet. But the point is that once we get rid of the profit motive, once we harness society's creativity, once we harness all the resources that we have, then we can start, first let's start with the basics. Let's get running water and electricity and food and housing and basic health care and education to everybody. Then we can continue. Like I said, it's not going to be an overnight process. We can then continue over the years, over the decades, improving everybody's quality of life to an unimaginably high level. I mean, so I think, it's clear that there's enough homes for the homeless people. I mean, there's enough empty buildings, even in our own city, to house all the homeless people in our city. There's enough food to go around. Did you know that Japan alone hoards hundreds of tons, thousands of tons of rice in order to keep the prices artificially high? If that rice was released and sent to places where there's no food, where people are starving to death, of course there's enough of these, at least these basic things. The bottom line is, though, that there's not enough within the limits of capitalism, in the sense that the owners of these companies, they produce to make profits. They don't produce for human need. It was an automaker once said, I can't remember who it was, but he said, I'm not in the business of making cars. I'm in the business of making money. And that's the bottom line. The people that make dish soap, they're not doing it because dish soap is needed by people in some sort of abstract moral sense. It's because people will buy it and they can make profit off of it. That's why they make these things. And if they can't make a profit off of it, they'll stop making it. And that's why when we say what we have right now, and the capitalist economists, the serious economists, all have to acknowledge that what we have is what's called, what Marx explained, was a crisis of overproduction, which means that there's too many goods, there's too much steel, there's too much sugar, there's too much pork, there's too many cars, whatever, too many of all these things, and that's why the prices are going down, and that's why, because the prices are going down and the profits then are going down for some of these things, and why are they going down? Because people can't buy them. Or why are they piling up? Why are the auto dealerships piling up cars? Because people don't have any money. They don't have any more credit to buy these things. Therefore, the companies start shutting down. It doesn't mean that there's not a lot of rotten cars out there, unsafe cars, and that more people wouldn't like a newer, safer vehicle. It's because there's too many within the narrow limits of a profit-driven market. That's what's too many of, you know. And so that's why I say, I mean, you've got plenty of people who would like to have a new car, and yet we're shutting down auto plants and laying off hundreds of thousands of auto workers. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense.
So what systems of socialism have been our best examples throughout time, or even for a short period of time? Even like, was there a time shortly after the Spanish Revolution, for example, or was there some point when it really looked like China, like communist China, was going to make that beautiful democratic socialist system, or are there some examples in Latin America, or is Cuba our best example? What are the really things that we look at and study and see like, oh, this is what I'm talking about right here?
Well, first of all, socialism has to be a world system. Just like capitalism is a world system, we're going to build on what capitalism has developed, the technology, the use of resources, the educated workforce, and so on. We're going to build on that, which is a world system, to create a world system of socialism. So even under capitalism, you have some countries produce certain goods that simply aren't available in other countries. So you have a world market to try and get, for example, countries that don't have any copper need to buy copper from countries that do have copper, or any other natural resources, as it were. But nowadays, of course, it's all organized. Everybody's trying to get the best out of each other and try to get the maximum profit out of that sort of exchange. You know, I'll pay you so much, per ton of copper, or whatever it is. It's all everybody's trying to get advantage of each other. Under socialism, we would rationally plan how we would use all those resources on a world scale. There's no single country, not even the United States, that could have socialism within its boundaries, because it's a global system. We're a global species. It's a global economy, and therefore socialism needs to be global. So socialism as such has never yet existed. A lot of people take that to mean that, oh, well, if it hasn't happened yet, it'll probably never happen, or it can never happen. But let's, before I talk a little bit more about some examples of some attempts at the beginnings of building of socialism, let me just point out that capitalism hasn't always existed either. I mean, here in this country, in the United States, on this continent, long before the Europeans came, people lived here for tens of thousands of years. In the United States, we talk about the Native Americans, or the first peoples in Canada, or the indigenous peoples in Latin America. They lived in societies that weren't capitalist. I mean, the Plains tribes in our part of the country, they weren't capitalists. They didn't have these class divisions. They didn't have prisons. They didn't have court system. They didn't have a standing army or police force that stood above and separate from the rest of society and enforced the rules of a tiny minority against the whole of society. They didn't have factories. We didn't have, it was a much more cooperative, actually, in many ways, a socialistic type of a society. So when we say that socialism hasn't happened yet, it doesn't mean that history's over and that it can't happen. Capitalism didn't exist before that either. In fact, before capitalism in Europe, you had feudalism. Before that, you had slave systems, the Roman Empire and the Greeks and so on, which were based on a different kind of economy, based on slavery. So my point is that just because socialism hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it won't happen. I would say that the best example, the most important example for us to learn from, for us as workers, for us as young people, for us as people that are interested in socialism and Marxism, is the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution of 1917, the October Revolution, as it's called, October 1917, when capitalism was overthrown in Russia, and you had the beginnings of the construction of a socialist society, where you actually had the beginnings of this very democratic participation of the masses in the running of their lives. But of course, Russia was a very backwards country. It had been through World War I. It was invaded by multiple armies of intervention that wanted to crush this example of ordinary working people, of peasants, of poor people in general, trying to actually take their lives into their hands. And over time, this revolution, this democratic participation of the masses degenerated. You ended up with the political control over that country going into the hands of people like Stalin, who you've probably heard about, and where you have this sort of bureaucratic, totalitarian caricature of what socialism should be, which, as we said, should be democratic. But those early years really are inspiring if we want to see some examples of how things could be.
Tell me more. What was inspiring? What was the most beautiful thing about it?
Well, I mean, throughout the history of revolutions, ever since the Paris Commune of 1871, which is an important episode in world working class history, where the French working class, the Parisian working class, actually rose up and took political power in the city of Paris for several weeks. Ever since then, you've had many examples where workers have risen up and tried to transform society, and you have very similar trends of things that happen in these revolutionary situations. We saw it in Paris in 1871, in Russia in 1905 and 1917. We saw it in the beginnings of the Spanish Revolution in the 1930s, and many other times. Now we're seeing examples of this in Latin America, for example, in Venezuela. And what it is where you have the beginnings of what we would call a workers' state, a state that represents the interests of the working class majority, as opposed to the state that we have in this country today, which is a state that defends the interests of the capitalist minority. And some of the elements of this new kind of state are, for example, the direct election of all public officials. All public officials should be directly elected and also accountable and recallable. They should be if we don't like what they're doing, they should be recallable. In the United States, as everybody knows, we don't even directly elect the president. We don't even have that basic democratic right in this country, let alone direct election and recallability. We also should have a constant rotation of the duties of society. Everybody should be able to participate in their local government, and eventually, if they keep doing the will of the people that have elected them, they should be able to move on to higher levels of national government, state, worldwide, whatever. There should be this rotation, so you don't have this sort of cast of professional politicians who represent the interests of that minority. All the lobbyists in Washington and all the politicians whose election viability, whether or not they might be elected or not, is often determined by how much money they have and how many rich supporters they have, and not based on their backers, not based on their ideas. They're backed by these minority of rich people. We also think that, and you've seen this in these revolutionary processes where these elected officials should not make any more money than the people that they represent. They shouldn't make any more than the average worker, than the skilled workers that they represent. So, for example, if we elect you to represent us at the local council, and some people might not know, but the word Soviet in Russian, all it means is committee or council. It's just like a committee. It's a council. If we elect you to represent our local committee of the neighbors, or of our factory, of our workplace, or of our school, or whatever, if you want to get better wages and conditions, you have to fight to improve our wages and conditions. That would help eliminate the careerism and the sort of bureaucratism, people that go into politics because they want perks and privileges, as opposed to people who are doing it because they really have convictions that that they want to help and improve the lives of the people that they represent. And then finally, another element that we see in these revolutionary processes is where you don't have a separate police and military force, which, as I said before, sort of stands above the rest of society and uses violence and force to defend the interests of the propertied minority. We're basically kind of like a neighborhood watch, where everybody kind of looks out for each other. You don't need a special armed body that can use that force. And of course, when people have a monopoly on force, that can be abused. You then have everybody kind of participating in the general defense of society. So those four conditions, where you have the direct election and recallability of officials, where those officials don't make any more than the workers that they represent, where there's a constant rotation of those duties, so you don't have careerism and bureaucratism, and then where you don't have the separate military or police force, which sort of stands above society. Those conditions then would lay the basis for what a much more democratic, much more direct, much more participatory, and much more egalitarian society could then begin to develop.
I'd like to follow through on something you said earlier that I found very intriguing. You said that socialism, to be ideal, would have to be a worldwide system. And so tell me, let's say hypothetically, Venezuela becomes as ideal a system as it can be, given the fact that all the rest of us are these capitalists. So now, what is it about being in this environment of other capitalist nation states which prevents Venezuela from rising to a pure form of socialism that just has good trade relations with its neighbors? What prevents that?
Well, first of all, as you correctly said, Venezuela hasn't yet established the foundations for a truly socialist society. There have been a lot of very progressive reforms, and a lot of important changes, and a lot of good things that have taken place. Nonetheless, the economy still remains largely in private hands. The state is still the government apparatus, the military, the courts, the laws, is still largely under control of the capitalist class, and of course, like I said, the economy is still under under private hands, and the land is still owned by a lot of landowners and so on. So, in order to take that next step, it would have to, like we said, expropriate the land, the big properties, and the banks, and so on, in order to begin that economic transformation. And also, the state would have to be organized more along the lines like I described earlier, where you have committees democratically electing representatives who are recallable and who don't make any more than the people they represent, as opposed to sort of parliamentary representative democracy, similar to what we have here, where we elect representatives to do whatever they want for 4 to 6 years, in between elections, as opposed to them actually being recallable and so on. So there is a long ways to go still in Venezuela. And but if they were to take that step, and I'm very optimistic that those steps will be taken by the Venezuelan working class, there's a much more awareness in Venezuela of the need for the working class to be at the head of the revolution, for these factories to be occupied and nationalized under workers' control. What you would end up having, though, is all kinds of sabotage taking place from surrounding countries, from the United States government and the big corporations, just like you have within Venezuela today. Sabotage on behalf of those private owners of the food companies, for example. The food companies are still largely in private hands, and because they want to destabilize the government, because they want to knock this idea out of the heads of the ordinary Venezuelans that they might somehow have some role to play in running their society, they try and destabilize things by having food shortages, by firing workers, by raising prices, and so on. There's this sort of constant sabotage taking place that doesn't allow the system to run smoothly. So that's why we think if they're not going to use, for example, a rice producing factory, if they're not going to use it in the interest of society, then they don't deserve to own it. And that's why society should own it. So
surely, John, you're selling capitalists short. Surely it's possible for a capitalist nation-state to respect the sovereignty of a socialist nation-state and to have relationships which honor that system which that nation has chosen. Surely that's possible.
Well, in the abstract, it may be possible, but it's never happened yet. So, you know, I don't think there's any examples of this, because what we're talking about is two fundamentally different ways of organizing society. Take the United States, for example, where the big corporations are owned by a handful of individuals to benefit that handful of individuals, as opposed to a socialist state where those corporations would be in the hands of the public, of society as a whole. That's a very incompatible system, and of course a country that made those steps would want to, that took those steps towards socialism, would want to engage in trade with its neighbors, because it is, after all, a global economy. They would still have to engage in trade. You can't have socialism in one country. But ultimately, for that to survive, you would have to have socialism in all the neighboring countries. Ultimately, you need to have a socialist federation of the Americas, of Latin America, including the United States and Canada, and ultimately of the whole world. And a lot of people might think that this seems very abstract and far-fetched and so on, but it really is, in my opinion, the only solution for humanity going forward. And that's why, for example, we've got this magazine called America Socialista, which means Socialist America, where we think that the whole of the Americas should be united. I mean, those borders are artificial. I mean, the borders that divide our peoples and divide the economies didn't exist a few hundred years ago. And we think that all the resources of all these countries, of all these peoples, should be harnessed to benefit the majority. Now, as far as what's going on in Venezuela, I would also definitely recommend this book, which is called Reformism or Revolution, which deals with sort of the Venezuelan revolution and explains the basic ideas of Marxism, using the Venezuelan revolution as a sort of a backdrop, and explaining through the debates that are taking place within Venezuela what the way forward is from a Marxist perspective. And you know, a book like this, it's got a lot of ideas in it, and it might seem that it might have a very limited impact because after all, it's just one book. But this book is actually having a big impact in Venezuela, and by extension throughout Latin America. And ultimately, I think that these ideas, the ideas of Marxism and socialism, are going to get a lot bigger echo here in the United States as well in the coming years, especially as people live through the effects of this capitalist crisis, where they see that capitalism doesn't work. One of the arguments people use against socialists is they say, well, socialism sounds good on paper, but it doesn't work in practice. Well, people are learning from their own experience that capitalism isn't working in practice. And I think people are more and more open to changing their way of thinking and to realizing that we have to think outside of what we've gotten used to, and that there is a way to harness society that's very different, and that would be socialism.
Well, John, this hour has gone so fast, I can't believe it. Do you have anything that you have to say that you really want to get across? Or?
Well, we could go for a couple more hours.
I know,
think,
it's just been wonderful. Thank you so much. I've gotten a lot out of it, and I hope our viewers